I give up on scripting video intros. 10 great consoles that failed. I should probably warn, this video is going to be just a little bit controversial because this may skew some people's opinions of consoles that failed. What I consider a failure is a console that comes out of the gate just bombing, or at the very least, ending up bombing down the line. Because a failure doesn't have exactly one definition when it comes to game consoles. There's multiple things that could be failures. For example, Stadia is a failure that still has millions of users and is still active to this day. The 3DS is a failure even though Nintendo was pushing it for quite some time and multiple people still stand by it. There's a lot of things that can be counted as failures when it comes to game consoles, and because of that, this list may piss some people off. Personally, I don't care. So without further ado, here's my list of consoles that were great but failed. Also, for the sake of people that may correct me in the comments, I understand that some things I may say may sound weird. It's because I'm congested at the moment. It doesn't sound like it because I'm pushing as hard as I can to not sound congested, but I recently just recovered from a very, very extreme cold. So, I'm congested. That's why I may mispronounce certain things. That's why my M's may sound like B's. Just work with me here. It's not fun. It bothers me so much. Yes, I am aware of the comedy that lies here. Just hear me out, though. Okay, I know we all have to rag on the 3DO for stuff like Plumbers Don't Wear Ties and all of the other porn games on it, but I have a point here, so hear me out. The 3DO was a genius idea, executed all wrong. The idea of just one console with different variations by different companies is literally the format we're following today with the PS5 and Xbox Series X. And say what you will, they're not as night and day as you think. The 3DO was in essence trying to do that, but it went about it the wrong way at the wrong time. Computing hardware wasn't advanced enough to make a one-size-fits-all console format like today, and not just that, this thing was released in 1993 at the height of the console war between Sega and Nintendo. The final nail in the coffin, Sony. The announcement of the PlayStation just weeks after the 3DO had launched killed any and all momentum they had, and while the games on it are legendarily terrible, this failure had a lot of potential in it that never went utilized. And on the topic of Sony, I know I'm on a roll with confusing ones here, but let me explain. The PS3 was initially released to very, very negative reception in 2006 because of multiple problems, honestly. For one, even before it launched, there were problems surfacing, like for example, when it was delayed from May 2005 to March 2006, and then one more time to November 11, 2006. Then once it released, the problems started to appear. To start with, the first issue was of course the price tag. When it was unveiled, Sony announced the lowest possible price for a PS3 with 20 gigabytes was a whopping $500. Wanted more storage? You better be ready to shell out another $100. The PS3 launch price was insane and immediately sent people away from it for gaming. The next problem was the advertising campaign. I'm not going into detail if you don't already see the problem here. I feel itchy. And of course, the biggest problem was it was already dated when it launched. PlayStation Network was about 2 years out, the controller had no vibration features, the launch lineup was terrible, and if you're a developer, forget about programming on this thing without there being a problem. It was notoriously irritating developing games for this thing thanks to Sony's decisions to make it that way intentionally. Why? Well, according to Kaz Hirai, the CEO at the time of this statement, we don't provide the easy to program for console that developers want because easy to program for means that anybody will be able to take advantage of pretty much what the hardware can do. So then the question is, what do you do for the rest of the 9.5 years? Ride it out! It was bold of you to just predict that this thing would last another 9.5 years. God forbid it didn't. Rather than just admitting it was a bad idea. Just because he correctly predicted the PS3's lifespan doesn't mean he was right to predict that statement entirely. Suffice to say, the PS3 didn't succeed at launch because of the games. It succeeded because it was a Blu-ray player. After Sony realized this, they woke up and brought the cost down significantly, removing and swapping out unnecessary things until 2009 when it finally turned a profit thanks to the rebranding and sold like hell, sending it to reach at least 80 million units sold worldwide as of 2017, just before it was finally discontinued in Japan, the last territory that was still selling it. And just for good measure on how successful this rebranding was, I still have my PS3. I don't really use it much because, well, PlayStation Now has PS3 games, so I don't really have to worry too much. But it's there, and I'm glad that it's still here. I'm glad that it still works, too. It should work, because this is only used for, like, streaming and stuff post-2013. Because my parents really didn't play much games after that. But, yeah, this is the last one I got. I used to have a Slim, but that was sold, and now I'm kind of regretting it. So, hoping this works. My dad and I are going to clean it soon, but yeah, this is pretty heavy. I got to go put it down now. If you look at the links as a Game Boy competitor, it's pretty bad. Garbage battery life, bulky design, decreased durability. Yeah, it pales in comparison. But on its own in 1989, this thing was fantastic. Technically, it was impressive. Its design was genius with an ambidextrous design in mind to flip and play southpaw. It was the first handheld to have a backlit color screen and had a fairly impressive set of technical abilities that really couldn't be achieved on such a relatively small gaming device in 1989. Not just that, but only a year later, Atari and Epyx managed to fix the biggest problems with it, along with bringing the cost down from $180 just to $99. While the Game Boy was still $90 at that time. For only $10 more, you got a significantly more powerful system that retailed for almost double the price about a year ago. That's a fantastic deal, and really, the Link should have sold leagues better than it did just because of that alone. But Nintendo and Sega still outperformed them by a steep margin. Atari was an aging name, but it wouldn't be alone in just 4 short years since Sega's downfall was following right behind Atari. Perhaps a little too close. The single best documented failure. Sega's third console in the West is an interesting case of a failure because if you grew up in Japan from 94 to 2000, Jesus! You may be confused as to why it's here because the Saturn was no slouch in Japan. No, wait, let me rephrase that. It outsold the Nintendo 64 by well over 1 million units by the time the year 2000 had hit. It seems Japan understood that the Saturn definitely had some promise and thus they just flocked to it for games. Unfortunately, because of that, it was hit with 3DO syndrome, well, with tons of adult content too, but there were well over 2,000 games released for it just in Japan alone, and it demolished Sony and Nintendo over there as well, which is nuts considering Nintendo has been holding the Japanese market hostage for years at that point. But in the West, it was the complete opposite. Sony demolished them, Nintendo obliterated them, and they unfortunately got themselves too, so this is actually a tale of tragedy if you really think about it. But the real question isn't what the hell happened to cause this, it's more or less how did Sega do this to themselves? Well, the perfect storm of problems. Fair warning, you should probably grab a snack because this is the longest part of the entire video. I'm not making this up, this is the genuinely longest segment. Please grab a snack before you continue because damn this is long and I did not think about this ahead of time, I apologize. First up, the Sega 32X. Sega of America attempted to extend the life of the Genesis with add-ons because it was doing extremely well here. This wouldn't have been a problem since if it was selling well here, it had to be selling well in Japan too, right? No, it was selling miserably in Japan because it was going up against the PC Engine, which is a story entirely on its own. I'm not getting into that right now, but just know NEC demolished everyone over there, including Sega, by a long shot. So Sega of Japan was ready to move on when 1994 rolled around. But America wasn't. So there was a disagreement on what to do next, make a new console just because one region wasn't doing so well, or make a new add-on and try to extend the life of a console that's doing extremely well worldwide. Of course, Sega of America had a brain and tried to convince Japan to go with it as an attempt to increase sales rather than extend the life, But Sega of Japan gave up on it already and decided to start working on and announce a successor to the Genesis/Mega Drive. Now Sega of America had no choice or else people would start importing the console. The Saturn released in 1994 to explosive sales in Japan for its power and capabilities, and it was also announced in May of 1995 at E3 in North America for sale in the West, and that same day it was also released for sale during the conference. It seemed great at first until you realize it wasn't just a surprise for consumers, it was a surprise for literally everybody, including Sega themselves. And not just that, but because it was a surprise to everybody, developers working on a game for the initial September 2nd release date now had to either release it right away or on schedule, which led to a stupidly huge amount jumping ship to the PlayStation or even the Nintendo 64, which outsold the Saturn nearly 3-1. And while the Nintendo 64 almost made this list, the Saturn was the better choice by far. And consumers did the same too because the Saturn was $400. The PlayStation, $300 with miles better games. Even the Nintendo 64 was cheaper at $200. But at this point there were already better alternatives in the form of the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation. So what the hell was the point in buying a Saturn if it was the more expensive yet lesser valued option in the first place? Sega offered no good games, they launched it out of nowhere so nobody was ready to go, and not just that, Sony had already prepped their console and launched it in the proper time window, which basically meant that everyone who bought the Saturn was going to be screwed anyway in like 4 months because the PlayStation would already be out by then. Not just that, but those who didn't even want the PlayStation went to the Nintendo 64 because the Saturn was released too early and the PlayStation wasn't exactly what they wanted either. So what is the point behind the Saturn? It is the dumbest thing you will ever think of if you really put your mind to it. It just was for nobody. But of course, it's not like Nintendo was perfect. Yeah, I'm on this bandwagon, so what? On top of the name just sounding like an expensive touchscreen controlled expansion for the Wii, that was an actual problem in 2012, by the way, you could research that. Nintendo did just about everything you shouldn't do with a console launch when it came to the Wii U, aside from releasing it by surprise. Thank God. First, they focused heavily on the touchscreen gamepad included with the console. So much so, people thought it was just an expensive touchscreen tablet add-on to the Wii that costed $300. Yikes. The Wii U actually sold so bad, it did worse than the Saturn. This thing looked exactly like a Wii, by the way, but it just was painted black most of the time. That was the only distinguishing factor here. But, of course, it had its upsides. For one, it was Nintendo's first HD console, and it was extremely high resolution, even rivaling that of the PlayStation 4 at the time. And no, I'm not kidding. This thing hit 1080p, no problem. The PS4 struggled to do that. Not just that, but it was entirely backwards compatible with Wii games. Emphasis on entirely. None of that except for crap like with the PS5 or Xbox Series X. No, it was entirely backwards compatible with the Wii because it was the successor but also a Wii on drugs. No emulation or anything. It runs the hardware and it supports the hardware. The Wii U also carried over the best feature from the Wii and went just a little nuts with it, if I may argue. Virtual Console. These games, all emulated but classic, are the best part of the two consoles, but nothing does it like the Wii U. The Wii U supported all past Virtual Console games from the Wii and more, adding Game Boy Advance, Nintendo 64, Nintendo DS, MSX, and PC Engine games, all just for the Wii U Virtual Console. Unfortunately, the most notorious omission was... This is number 5, by the way. The Gamecube is loved by every Nintendo fan and respected by non-Nintendo fans because it tried its damn hardest to outdo Sony and Microsoft. That's adorable. Seriously though, the Gamecube was a respectable failure in Nintendo's history because it was a failure that was good. The problem with it solely was just the design and the media format they chose. Nintendo had some sort of strange phobia to CDs for like 10 years thanks to Sony, so they didn't utilize them until the Gamecube, except they still didn't. Rather than using regular DVDs like the competition did, Nintendo opted for a proprietary mini-disc format which was really dumb. It held less than half the data of a DVD, was expensive to produce, and just wasn't worth it. Meanwhile, DVDs were cheap, easy to use since it was standardized, and held a lot more data, at a whopping 8 gigabytes for a dual-layered disc. And the design of the GameCube didn't help either. It had a handle, was rather small, and actually, it kind of resembled a lunchbox. But the GameCube was respected because of the games that resided in its library. While Nintendo published most of them, they were all underrated masterpieces and were loved by those who owned the console. Super Mario Sunshine, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Super Smash Bros. Melee, Wind Waker, Resident Evil 4, Metroid Prime. My god, this library is gold! And the controller, as weird as it looks, is actually very well made. It's the controller that Smash fans just won't let die, and for good reason. It's solid, well designed, and takes everything into consideration, just like the console itself. It was more powerful than a PS2, it had a better controller without needing vibration, and it was extremely innovative in a time where gamers were craving diversity, which is exactly why the Gamecube is so well respected, even if the PS2 squashed it like a bug by outselling it 75-1. We had to love the purple lunchbox. I am on a strange Nintendo streak here, but I can't make a list like this without talking about the Pokemon Mini in some form. Manufactured by Nintendo, the Pokemon Mini was released on November 16, 2001, just 2 days before the Gamecube, flag number 1. It was the smallest handheld console to use interchangeable cartridges ever released and was chock full of features, and although it was technically on par with the Game Boy, flag number 2, it was still rather impressive for how small it was and for how stuffed it was in 2001. All of the games on it were Pokemon themed, flag number 3, and made sure to utilize all the console's features like the force feedback, infrared port, internal clock, and motion detection in every pixel of the screen, flag number 4. Now for the problems. Number 1. The GameCube was far more anticipated than its aunt of a console, literally being what Nintendo fans had wanted, a lot more than the Pokemon Tamagotchi clone that was released 2 days earlier. Number 2. It was technically on par with the Game Boy at a time when the Game Boy Advance, the third console in the Game Boy family, was already out for 5 months. It was dated at launch because of that. Number 3. There were Pokemon games on the way for the Game Boy Advance, a console of which was fully backwards compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Not just that, but a console targeted only to Pokemon fans in the infancy of the franchise is a bad idea. Finally, number 4, the console was just too small. It couldn't display half the things properly because of the screen resolution, which was 96 by 64 pixels on a 1-inch display. While the rest of the features were staggeringly plentiful, they don't matter when the screen is so small you can't see it without squinting, holding it 2 inches from your eyes. Need I say more why this thing barely moved enough units for the sales numbers to be documented? Of course, number 3 is the Xbox, because what else would it be? There's not much to really say about the OG Xbox to prove why it sold so miserably. It was reasonably priced, it had good games, Sega was backing it absolutely hard, and it had the greatest launch in console history, so I can't really pin down the reason for why it failed, just outside of pure misfortune. A win up against the PlayStation 2, and although the Xbox was way more powerful and did what the PS2 could and more, Sony just couldn't be touched. I really wish I could say more, but I genuinely can't figure it out. It just flopped hard. If you want to experience this console to see what I mean, you're gonna have to buy one because this one is particularly hard to emulate. Oh, the PS Vita. The one handle I wish I could have gotten, but didn't because it was actually expensive. The Vita is a perfect example of great idea, garbage time. The Vita had it all for 2011. Dual analog, sleek design, gorgeous OLED multi-touch display, a rear touchpad, and in general, an amazing and sturdy design. It had to be a surefire success, right? Sony made a big mistake by releasing this when they did, let alone allowing it to hit mass production in 2011. The console was wildly expensive at $250, had little to no first-party or third-party support, and had very minimal marketing at the time. Now, the price tag does seem rather reasonable, so how was it so expensive? The memory cards. The proprietary Vita cards were insanely expensive, with just a 16GB card costing $70. Meanwhile, an SD card of the same capacity, sold in 2011, would cost a fraction of the price. Sony apparently did this to curb piracy, but it didn't work. Hackers found a way to crack the Vita and load homebrews without needing the PlayStation Store. While the PS Vita was in essence a portable PS3, it was just a really bad time for it to release. The second best example of a great console that failed miserably. What's number 1? Well, you're gonna see right now. And of course, the most legendary failure is none other than the Sega Dreamcast. The Dreamcast is the best case of a console that failed for no other reason outside of 3 other consoles: the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation 2, and the Microsoft Xbox. The Dreamcast on its own was shockingly advanced for the time it was released. In 1998, it technologically stomped on everyone with unmatched graphics, an advanced CPU, an innovative controller and memory card, and proprietary media that didn't suck. Sega was finally all set for success again with the Dreamcast, but of course someone will put a screeching halt to that not long after the success had shown. Sony was responsible for bringing Sega to bits, that's funny, with the PlayStation. So, how can you get lower than rock bottom? Grab the shovel and keep digging, buddy. This is what Sony did when they unveiled the PlayStation 2 just 11 days after the Dreamcast launched in North America.
That's That's gonna hurt.
This wouldn't have been such a big problem for Sega though, had they handled the Saturn a bit better. I partially blame Bernie Stoller for this, because people were finally warming up to Sega until he uttered the dumbest thing in gaming history during E3 '97. When he was speaking about the Saturn and the future of Sega, he said, "The Saturn is not our future." I respect him for bringing the Dreamcast to life, but dude, at least stand by your company's mess rather than just throwing it away. Because you made that mess, just stand by it and work on it as best you can. Don't just toss it out the window. The Saturn had a shred of light. You literally put a pillow to its face while it was finally recovering. You tell developers, hey, we know you're getting ready to finally release something for our struggling console, but don't bother wasting your money. We're killing it. It wasn't dying, it was down but not out. The Dreamcast was on its way, yes, but don't kill your current product. It built the basis for a successor. Even Sony knew this. How did you blow it that badly? And of course, the Microsoft Xbox announcement was the last nail in the coffin. After everything else, after the mess of the Sega Saturn, after the announcement of the PlayStation 2, if the Dreamcast had any hope after all of that, Microsoft made quick work of it and ended the run of Sega's latest console after just 2 years, as the Dreamcast was discontinued alongside Sega's hardware development in general. This is what I mean by like the Saturn was a tale of tragedy, because the Saturn actually links to this.
Tricks make me sick. You won't have it. You're